Hello everybody and welcome back for yet another Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. Here we are on a Monday and we're going to kick off this week with Chapter 3 of Book 2, the Machiavellian Intelligence Hypothesis. If you remember, Harry and Draco had just conducted their first magical scientific experiment tests and discovered that the blood hypothesis, the reason for wizards being stronger, was not because of blood inheritance, but was basically due to hard work and study, like you get good at most things. Draco struggled to accept this and laid a torture curse on Harry's hand, and then locked Harry in the room that they were in. And that's where we have left Harry trying to figure out whether, at the very last moment, Flitwick arrived and opened the door. So let's continue. Act 3. Draco waited in a small windowed alcove he'd found near the Great Hall, stomach churning. There would be a price, and it would not be small. Draco had known that as soon as he'd woken up and realized that he didn't dare enter the Great Hall for breakfast because he might see Harry Potter there, and Draco didn't know what would happen after that. Footsteps approached. "Here you go," said Vincent's voice. "Now the boss ain't in a good mood, so you better watch yourself." Draco was going to skin that idiot alive and send back the flayed body with a request for a more intelligent servant, like a dead gerbil. One set of footsteps went off, and the other set of footsteps came closer. The churning in Draco's stomach got worse. Harry Potter came into sight. His face was carefully neutral, but his blue-trimmed robes looked oddly askew, as if they hadn't been put on quite right. "Your hand," Draco said without thinking about it at all. Harry raised his left arm as though to look at it himself. The hand dangled limply from it, like something dead. "Madame Pomfrey said it's not permanent," Harry said quietly. She said it would mostly recover by the time classes start tomorrow." For a single instant, the news came as a relief, and then Draco realized. "You went to Madame Pomfrey," whispered Draco. "Of course I did," said Harry, as though stating the obvious. "My hand wasn't working." It was slowly dawning on Draco what an absolute fool he'd been. Far worse than the older Slytherins he'd chewed out. He'd just taken for granted that no one would go to the authorities when a Malfoy did something to them. That no one would want Lucius Malfoy's eye on them ever. But Harry Potter wasn't a frightened little Hufflepuff trying to stay out of the game. He was already playing it, and Father's eye was already on him. "What else did Madame Pomfrey say?" said Draco, his heart in his throat. "Professor Flitwick said that the spell cast on my hand had been a dark torture hex, an extremely serious business, and that refusing to say who did it was absolutely unacceptable." There was a long pause. "And then?" said Draco in a shaking voice. Harry Potter smiled slightly. "I apologized deeply, which made Professor Flitwick look very stern, and then I told Professor Flitwick that the whole thing was indeed extremely serious, secret, delicate business, and that I'd already informed the headmaster about the project." Draco gasped. "No, Flitwick isn't going to just accept that. He'll check with Dumbledore." "Indeed," said Harry Potter. "I was promptly hauled off to the headmaster's office." Draco was trembling now. If Dumbledore brought Harry Potter before the Wizengamot, willingly or otherwise, and had the boy who lived testify under veritaserum that Draco had tortured him, too many people loved Harry Potter. Father could lose that vote. Father might be able to convince Dumbledore not to do that, but it would cost terribly. The game had rules now. You couldn't just threaten someone at random anymore. But Draco had walked into Dumbledore's hands of his own free will, and Draco was a very valuable hostage. Though since Draco couldn't be a Death Eater now, he wasn't as valuable as Father thought. The thought tore at his heart like a cutting charm. "Then what?" whispered Draco. "Dumbledore deduced immediately that it was you. He knew we'd been associating." The worst possible scenario. If Dumbledore hadn't guessed who did it, he might have risked using legilimency just to find out. But if Dumbledore knew... And... Draco forced out the word. "We had a little chat." "And?" Harry Potter grinned. "And I explained that it would be in his best interest not to do anything." Draco's mind ran into a brick wall and splattered. He just stared at Harry Potter with his mouth hanging like a slack fool. It took that long for Draco to remember. Harry knew Dumbledore's mysterious secret, the one Snape used as his hold. Draco could just see it now. Dumbledore looking all stern, concealing his eagerness as he explained to Harry what a terribly serious matter this was, and Harry politely telling Dumbledore to keep his mouth shut if he knew what was good for him. Father had warned Draco against people like this, people who could ruin you and still be so likeable that it was hard to hate them properly. After which, Harry said, the headmaster told Professor Flitwick that this was indeed a secret and delicate matter of which he had already been informed, and that he did not think pressing it at this time would help me or anyone. Professor Flitwick started to say something about the headmaster's usual plotting gone much too far, and I had to interrupt at that point and explain that it had been my own idea and not anything the headmaster forced me into. So Professor Flitwick spun around and started lecturing me, and the headmaster interrupted him and said that as the boy who lived, I was doomed to have weird and dangerous adventures, so I was safer if I got into them on purpose instead of waiting for them to happen by accident. And that was when Professor Flitwick threw up his little hands and started shrieking in a high-pitched voice at both of us about how he didn't care what we were cooking up together, but this wasn't ever to happen again for as long as I was in Ravenclaw House, or he'd have me thrown out and I could go to Gryffindor, which was where all this Dumbledoring belonged. Harry was making it very hard for Draco to hate him. Anyway, Harry said, I didn't want to be thrown out of Ravenclaw, so I promised Professor Flitwick that nothing like this would happen again, and if it did, I would just tell him who did it. Harry's eyes should have been cold. They weren't. The voice should have made it a deadly threat. It wasn't. And Draco saw the question that should have been obvious, and it killed the mood in an instant. Why didn't you? Harry walked over to the window, into the small beam of sunlight shining into the alcove, and turned his head outward toward the green grounds of Hogwarts. The brightness shone on him, on his robes, on his face. Why didn't I? Harry said, his voice caught. I guess because I just couldn't get angry at you. I knew I'd hurt you first. I won't even call it fair, because what I did to you was worse than what you did to me. It was like running into another brick wall. Harry could have been speaking archaic Greek for all Draco understood him then. Draco's mind scrabbled for patterns and came up flat blank. The statement was a concession that had been in Harry's best interests. It wasn't even what Harry should say to make Draco a more loyal servant, now that Harry held power over him. For that, Harry should have been emphasizing how kindly he'd been, not how much he'd hurt Draco. Even so, Harry said, and now his voice was lower, almost a whisper. Please don't do that again, Draco. It hurt, and I'm not sure I could forgive you a second time. I'm not sure I'd be able to want to. Draco just didn't get it. Was Harry trying to be friends with him? There was no way Harry Potter could be dumb enough to believe that was still possible after what he'd done. You could be someone's friend and ally, just like Draco had tried to do with Harry, or you could destroy their life and leave them no other options. Not both. But then Draco didn't understand what else Harry could be trying. And a strange thought came to Draco then, something Harry had kept talking about yesterday. And the thought was, test it. You're awakened as a scientist now. Harry had said that. And even if you never learn to use your power, you'll always be looking for ways to test your beliefs. The ominous words, spoken in gasps of agony, had kept running through Draco's mind. If Harry was pretending to be the repentant friend who had accidentally hurt someone, "You planned what you did to me," Draco said, managing to put a note of accusation in his voice. "You didn't do it because you got angry. You did it because you wanted to." "Fool," Harry Potter would say. "Of course I planned it, and now you're mine." Harry turned towards Draco. "What happened yesterday wasn't the plan," Harry said, his voice seeming stuck in his throat. "The plan was that I would teach you why you were always better off knowing the truth, and then we would try together to discover the truth about blood. And whatever the answer was, we would accept it. Yesterday I rushed things." "Always better off knowing the truth," Draco said coldly. "Like you did me a favour?" Harry nodded, blowing Draco's mind completely, and said, "What if Lucius comes up with the same idea I did? That the problem is stronger wizards having fewer children. He might start a program to pay the strongest purebloods to have more children. In fact, if blood purism were right, that's just what Lucius should be doing. Addressing the problem on his side, where he can make things happen right away. Right now, that's Harry speaking, my bad." Harry nodded, blowing Draco's mind completely, and said, "What if Lucius had come up with the same idea I did? That the problem is stronger wizards having fewer children. He might start a program to pay stronger purebloods to have more children. In fact, if blood purism were right, that's just what Lucius should be doing. Addressing the problem on his side, where he can make the right things happen right away. Right now, Draco, you're the only friend Lucius has who would try to stop him from wasting the effort, because you're the only one who knows the real truth and can predict the real results." The thought came to Draco that Harry Potter had been raised in a place so strange that he was now effectively a magical creature rather than a wizard. Draco simply couldn't guess what Harry would say or do next. "Why?" Draco said, putting pain and betrayal in his voice. Wasn't hard at all. "Why did you do this to me? What was your plan?" "Well," Harry said, "you're Lucius's heir, and believe it or not, Dumbledore thinks I belong to him. So we could grow up and fight their battles with each other. Or we could do something else." Slowly, Draco's mind wrapped around this. "You want to provoke a fight to the finish between them, then seize power after they're both exhausted." Draco felt cold dread in his chest. He would have to try and stop that, no matter the cost to himself. But Harry shook his head. "Stars above, no! No? You wouldn't go along with that, and neither would I," said Harry. "This is our world. We don't want to break it. But imagine, say, Lucius thought that the conspiracy was your tool, and you were on my side. Dumbledore thought the conspiracy was my tool, and I was on his side. Lucius thought that you turned me, and Dumbledore believed the conspiracy was mine. Dumbledore thought that I turned you, and Lucius believed the conspiracy was yours. And so they both helped us out, but only in ways that the other wouldn't notice." Draco did not have to fake being speechless. Father had once taken him to see a play called The Tragedy of Light, about this incredibly clever Slytherin named Light, who'd set out to purify the world of evil using an ancient ring that could kill anyone whose name and face he knew, and who'd been opposed by another incredibly clever Slytherin, a villain named Lawleet, who'd worn a disguise to conceal his true face. And Draco had shouted and cheered at all the right parts, especially in the middle, and then the play had ended sadly, and Draco had been hugely disappointed. And Father had gently pointed out that the word tragedy was right there in the title. Afterward, Father had asked Draco if he understood why they had gone to see the play. Draco had said it was to teach him to be as cunning as Light and Lawlet when he grew up. Father had said that Draco couldn't possibly be more wrong, and pointed out that while Lawlet had cleverly concealed his face, there had been no good reason for him to tell Light his name. Father had then gone on to demolish almost every part of the play, while Draco listened with his eyes growing wider and wider. And Father had finished by saying that plays like this were always unrealistic, because if the playwright had known what someone actually as smart as Light would actually do, the playwright would have tried to take over the world himself instead of just writing plays about it. That was when Father had told Draco about the rule of 3, which was that any plot which required more than 3 different things to happen would never work in real life. Father had further explained that since only a fool would attempt a plot that was as complicated as possible, the real limit was 2. Draco couldn't even find words to describe the sheer gargantuan unworkability of Harry's master plan. But it was just the sort of mistake you would make if you didn't have any mentors and thought you were clever and had learned about plotting by watching plays. "So," said Harry, "what do you think of the plan?" "It's clever," Draco said slowly. Shouting "Brilliant!" and gasping in awe would have looked too suspicious. "Harry, can I ask a question?" "Sure," said Harry. "Why did you buy Granger an expensive pouch?" "To show no hard feelings," said Harry at once, "though I expect she'll also feel awkward if she refuses any small requests I make over the next couple of months." And that was when Draco realised that Harry was trying to be his friend. Harry's move against Granger had been smart, maybe even brilliant. Make your enemy not suspect you, and put them into your debt in a friendly way so that you could maneuver them into position just by asking them. Draco couldn't have gotten away with that. His target would have been too suspicious, but the boy who lived could. So the first step of Harry's plot was to give his enemy an expensive present. Draco wouldn't have thought of that, but it could work. If you were Harry's enemy, his plots might be hard to see through at first. They might even seem stupid, but his reasoning would make sense once you understood it. You would comprehend that he was trying to hurt you. That way, the way Harry was acting towards Draco right now did not make sense. Because if you were Harry's friend, then he'd try to be friends with you in the alien, incomprehensible way he'd been raised by muggles to do, even if it meant destroying your entire life. The silence stretched. I know I've abused our friendship terribly," Harry said finally, "but please realise, Draco, that in the end, I just wanted the 2 of us to find the truth together. Is that something you can forgive?" A fork with 2 paths, but with only one path easy to go back on later if Draco changed his mind. "I guess I understand what you were trying to do," Draco lied. "So, yes." Harry's eyes lit up. "I'm glad to hear that, Draco," he said softly. The 2 students stood in that alcove, Harry still dipped in the lone sunbeam, Draco in shadow. And Draco realised with a note of horror and despair that although it was a terrifying fate indeed to be Harry's friend, Harry now had so many different avenues for threatening Draco that being his enemy would be even worse. Probably. Maybe. Well, he could always switch to being enemies later. He was doomed. "So," said Draco, "now what?" "We study again next Saturday." "It better not be like the last one." "Don't worry, it won't," said Harry. "A few more Saturdays like that and you'll be ahead of me." Harry laughed. Draco didn't. "Oh, and before you go," Harry said, and grinned sheepishly, "I know this is a bad time, but I wanted to ask you for advice about something, actually." "Okay," Draco said, still a bit distracted by that last statement. Harry's eyes grew intent. "Buying that pouch for Granger used up most of the gold I managed to steal from my Gringotts vault." "What?" "And McGonagall has the vault key, or Dumbledore does now, maybe. And I was just about to launch a plot that might take some money. So I was wondering if you know how I can get access." "I'll loan you money," said Draco, mouth in sheer existential reflex. Harry looked taken aback, but in a pleased way. "Draco, you don't have to." "How much?" Harry named the amount, and Draco couldn't quite keep the shock from showing on his face. That was almost all the spending money Father had given Draco to last out the whole year. Draco would be left with just a few galleons. Then Draco mentally kicked himself. All he had to do was write to Father and explain that the money had gone because he'd managed to loan it to Harry Potter, and Father would send him a special congratulatory note written in golden ink, a giant chocolate frog that would take 2 weeks to eat, and 10 times as many galleons just in case Harry Potter needed another loan. "It's way too much, isn't it?" said Harry. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked." "Excuse me, I am a Malfoy, you know," said Draco. "I was just surprised you wanted that much." "Don't worry," Harry Potter said cheerfully. "It's nothing that threatens your family's interests, just me being evil." Draco nodded. "No problem then. You want to go get it right now?" "Sure," said Harry. And they left the alcove and started heading towards the dungeons. Draco couldn't help but ask, "So, can you tell me which plot this is for?" "Rita Skeeter." Draco thought some very bad words to himself, but it was far too late to say no. By the time they reached the dungeons, Draco had started pulling together his thoughts again. He was having trouble hating Harry Potter. Harry had been trying to be friendly, but he was just insane. And that wasn't going to stop Draco's revenge or even slow it down. So, Draco said, after looking around to make certain no one was nearby. Their voices would both be blurred, of course, but it never hurt to be extra sure. "I've been thinking, when we bring new recruits into the conspiracy, they're going to have to think we're equals. Otherwise, it would only take one of them to blow the plot to Father. You already worked that out, right?" "Naturally," said Harry. "Will we be equals?" said Draco. "I'm afraid not," Harry said. It was clear that he was trying to sound gentle, and also clear that he was trying to suppress a good deal of condescension and not quite succeeding. "I'm sorry, Draco, but you don't even know what the word Bayesian in Bayesian conspiracy means. Right now, you're going to have to study for months before we can take anyone else in, just so you can put up a good front." "Because I don't know enough science," Draco said, carefully keeping his voice neutral. Harry shook his head at that. "The problem isn't that you're ignorant of specific science things like deoxyribonucleic acid. That wouldn't stop you from being my equal. The problem is that you aren't trained in the methods of rationality, the deeper secret knowledge behind how all those discoveries got made in the first place. I'll try to teach you those, but they're a lot harder to learn. Think of what we did yesterday, Draco. Yes, you did some of the work, but I was the one in control. You answered some of the questions. I asked all of them. You helped push. I did the steering by myself. And without the methods of rationality, Draco, you can't possibly steer the conspiracy where it needs to go. I see, said Draco, his voice sounding disappointed. Harry's voice tried to be gentle itself even more. I'll try to respect your expertise, Draco, about things like people stuff, but you need to respect my expertise too. And there's just no way you could be my equal when it comes to steering the conspiracy. You've only been a scientist for 1 day, and you know one secret about deoxyribonucleic acid, and you aren't trained in any of the methods of rationality. I understand, said Draco, and he did. People stuff, Harry had said. Seizing control of the conspiracy probably wouldn't even be difficult. And afterward, he would kill Harry Potter just to be sure. The memory rose up in Draco of how sick inside it had felt last night, knowing Harry was screaming. Draco thought some more bad words. Fine, he wouldn't kill Harry. Harry had been raised by muggles. It wasn't his fault he was insane. Instead, Harry would live on just so that Draco could tell him that it had been for Harry's own good. Really, he ought to be grateful. And with a sudden twitch of surprised pleasure, Draco realised that it actually was for Harry's own good. If Harry tried to carry out his plan of playing Dumbledore and Father for Fools, he would die. That made it perfect. Draco would take all of Harry's dreams away from him, just as Harry had done to him. Draco would tell Harry that it had been for his own good, and it would be absolutely true. Draco would wield the conspiracy and the power of science to purify the wizarding world, and Father would be as proud of him as if he'd been a Death Eater. Harry Potter's evil plots would be foiled, and the forces of right would prevail. The perfect revenge. Unless, just pretend to be pretending to be a scientist, Harry had told him. Draco didn't have words to describe exactly what was wrong with Harry's mind. Since Draco had never heard the term depth of recursion, but he could guess what sort of plots it implied. Unless all that was exactly what Harry wanted Draco to do as part of some even larger plot, which Draco would play right into by trying to foil this one. Harry might even know that his plan was unworkable. It might have no purpose except luring Draco to thwart it. No, that way lay madness. There had to be a limit. The Dark Lord himself hadn't been that twisty. That sort of thing didn't happen in real life, only in Father's silly bedtime stories about foolish gargoyles who always ended up furthering the hero's plans every time they tried to stop him. And beside Draco, Harry walked along with a smile on his face, thinking about the evolutionary origins of human intelligence. In the beginning, before people had quite understood how evolution worked, they'd gone around thinking crazy ideas like human intelligence evolved so that we could invent better tools. The reason why this was crazy was that only one person in the tribe had to invent a tool, and then everyone else would use it. And it would spread to other tribes and still be used by their descendants 100 years later. That was great from the perspective of scientific progress, but in evolutionary terms, it meant that the person who invented something didn't have much of a fitness advantage, didn't have all the many more children than everyone else. Only relative fitness advantages could increase the relative frequency of a gene in the population and drive some lonely mutation to the point where it was universal and everyone had it. And brilliant inventions just weren't common enough to provide that sort of consistent selection pressure it took to promote a mutation. It was a natural guess, if you looked at humans with their guns and tanks and nuclear weapons and compared them to chimpanzees, that the intelligence was there to make the technology. A natural guess, but wrong. Before people had quite understood how evolution worked, they'd gone around thinking crazy ideas like the climate changed and tribes had to migrate and people had become smarter in order to solve all the novel problems. But human beings had 4 times the brain size of a chimpanzee. 20% of a human's metabolic energy went into feeding the brain. Humans were ridiculously smarter than any other species. That sort of thing didn't happen because the environment stepped up the difficulty of its problems a little. Then the organisms would just get a little smarter to solve them. Ending up with the gigantic outside brain must have taken some sort of runaway evolutionary process, something that would push and push without limits. And today's scientists had a pretty good guess at what that runaway evolutionary process had been. Harry had once read a famous book called Chimpanzee Politics. The book had described how an adult chimpanzee named Louis had confronted the aging alpha Yerion with the help of a young, recently matured chimpanzee named Nicky. Nicky had not intervened directly in the fights between Louis and Yerion, but had prevented Yerion's other supporters in the tribe from coming to his aid, distracting them whenever a confrontation developed between Louis and Yerion. And in time, Louis had won and become the new alpha, with Nicky as the second most powerful. Though it hadn't taken very long after that for Nicky to form an alliance with the defeated Yerion, overthrow Louis, and become the new alpha. It really made you appreciate what millions of years of hominids trying to outwit each other, an evolutionary arms race without incident, had led to in the way of increased mentality. Because, a human would have totally seen that one coming. And beside Harry, Draco walked along, suppressing his smile as he thought about his revenge. Someday, maybe in years, but someday, Harry would learn just what it meant to underestimate a Malfoy. Draco had awakened as a scientist in a single day. Harry had said that wasn't supposed to happen for months. But of course, if you were a Malfoy, you would be a more powerful scientist than anyone who wasn't. So Draco would learn all of Harry Potter's methods of rationality, and then when the time was ripe, dun dun dun. So that brings us to chapter 4. We're only halfway through our session. Let me just check. Okay, we'll give it a crack. Don't know if we'll get to the end of this chapter, but we'll keep going. Chapter 4. Holding off on proposing solutions. Act 2. The sun shone brilliantly in the great hall from the enchanted ceiling above, illuminating the students as they sat beneath the naked sky, gleaming from their plates and bowls as, refreshed by a night's sleep, they inhaled breakfast in preparation for whatever plans they made for their Sunday. So, there was only one thing that made you a wizard. That wasn't surprising when you thought about it. What DNA mostly did was tell ribosomes how to chain amino acids together into proteins. Conventional physics seemed quite capable of describing amino acids, and no matter how many amino acids you chain together, conventional physics said you would never, ever get magic out of it. And yet, magic seemed to be hereditary, following DNA. Then that probably wasn't because the DNA was chaining together non-magical amino acids into magical proteins. Rather, the key DNA sequence did not, of itself, give you your magic at all. Magic came from somewhere else. At the Ravenclaw table, there was one boy who was staring off into space, as his right hand automatically spooned some unimportant food into his mouth from whatever was in front of him. You probably could have substituted a pile of dirt and he wouldn't have even noticed. And for some reason, the source of magic was paying attention to a particular DNA marker among individuals who were ordinary ape-ascended humans in every other way. Actually, there was quite a lot of boys and girls staring off into space. It was the Ravenclaw table, after all. There were other lines of logic leading to the same conclusion. Complex machinery was always universal with a sexually reproducing species. If gene B relied on gene A, then gene A had to be useful on its own and rise to near universality in the gene pool on its own, before B would be useful often enough to confer a fitness advantage. Then once B was universal and you would get a variant of A asterisk, then that relied on B. And then C, that relied on A asterisk and B, then B asterisk, that relied on C. Until the whole machine would fall apart if you removed a single piece. But it would have to happen incrementally. Evolution never looked ahead. Evolution would never start promoting B in preparation for A becoming universal later. This is a toughie. Evolution was the simple historical fact that whichever organisms did in fact have the most children, their genes would in fact be more frequent in the next generation. So each piece of a complex machine had to become nearly universal before other pieces in the machine would evolve to depend on its presence. So complex independent machinery, the powerful sophisticated protein machines that drove life, was always universal within a sexually reproducing species, except for a small handful of non-interdependent variants that were being selected on at any given time, as further complexity was slowly laid down. It was why all human beings had the same underlying brain design, the same emotions, the same facial expressions wired up to those emotions. Those adaptations were complex, so they had to be universal. If magic had been like that, a big complex adaptation with lots of necessary genes, then a wizard mating with a muggle would have resulted in a child with only half those parts, and half the machine wouldn't do much. And so there would have been no muggle-borns, ever. Even if all the pieces had individually gotten into the muggle gene pool, they'd never reassemble all in one place to form a wizard. There hadn't been some genetically isolated valley of humans that had stumbled onto an evolutionary pathway leading to a sophisticated magical sections of the brain. That complex genetic machinery, if wizards interbred with muggles, would never have reassembled into muggleborns. So, however your genes made you a wizard, it wasn't by containing the blueprints for complicated machinery. That was the other reason Harry had guessed the Mendelian pattern would be there. If magical genes weren't complicated, why would there be more than one? And yet, magic itself seemed pretty complicated. A door-locking spell would prevent the door from opening and prevent you from transfiguring the hinges and resist Finite Incantatem and Alohomora. Many elements all pointing in the same direction. You could call that goal-orientated, or in simpler language, purposefulness. There were only two known causes of purposeful complexity: natural selection, which produced things like butterflies, and intelligent engineering, which produced things like cars. Magic didn't seem like something that had self-replicated into existence. Spells were purposefully complicated, but not like the butterfly, complicated for the purpose of making copies of themselves. Spells were complicated for the purpose of serving the user, like a car. Some intelligent engineer, then, had created the source of magic and told it to pay attention to a particular DNA marker. The obvious next thought was that this had something to do with Atlantis. Harry had asked Hermione about that earlier on the train to Hogwarts after hearing Draco say it, and so far as she knew, nothing more was known than the word itself. It might have been pure legend, But it was also plausible enough that a civilization of magic users, especially one from before the interdict of Merlin, would have managed to blow itself up. The line of reasoning continued. Atlantis had been an isolated civilization that had somehow brought into being the source of magic and told it to serve only people with the Atlantean genetic marker, the blood of Atlantis. And by similar logic, the words a wizard spoke, the wand movements, those weren't complicated enough of themselves to build up the spell effects from scratch, not the way that the 3 billion base pairs of human DNA actually were complicated enough to build a human body from scratch, not the way that the computer programs took up thousands of bytes of data. So the words and wand movements were just triggers, levers pulled on some hidden and more complex machine, buttons, not blueprints. And just like a computer program wouldn't compile if you made a single spelling error, the source of magic wouldn't respond to you unless you cast your spells in exactly the right way. At last, the chain of logic was inexorable, and it led inevitably toward a final conclusion. The ancient forebears of wizards, thousands of years earlier, had told the source of magic to only levitate things if you said Wingardium Leviosa. Harry slumped his head over the breakfast table, resting his forehead wearily on his right arm. There was a story from the dawn days of artificial intelligence, back when they were just starting out and no one had yet realized the problem would be difficult, about a professor who had delegated one of his grad students to solve the problem of computer vision. Harry was beginning to understand how that grad student must have felt. This could take a while. Why did it take more effort to cast the Alohomora spell if it was just like pressing a button? Who'd been silly enough to build in a spell for Avada Kedavra that could only be cast using hatred? Why did wordless transfiguration require you to make a complete mental separation between the concept of form and the concept of material? Harry might not be done with this problem by the time he graduated Hogwarts. He could still be working on this problem when he was 30 years old. Hermione had been right. Harry hadn't realized that on a gut level before. He'd just given an inspiring speech about determination. Harry's mind briefly considered whether to get on a gut level that he might never solve the problem at all, then decided that would be taking things much too far. Besides, so long as he could get as far as immortality in the first few decades, he'd be fine. What method had the Dark Lord used? Come to think, the fact that the Dark Lord had somehow managed to survive the death of his first body was almost infinitely more important than the fact that he'd tried to take over magical Britain. "Excuse me," said an unexpected voice from behind him in very unexpected tones. "At your convenience, Mr. Malfoy requests the favour of conversation." Harry did not choke on his breakfast cereal. Instead, he turned around and beheld Mr. Crabbe. "Excuse me," said Harry. "Don't you mean the boss wants to talk with yous?" Mr. Crabbe didn't look happy. "Mr. Malfoy instructed me to speak properly." "I can't hear you," Harry said. "You're not speaking properly." He turned back to his bowl of tiny blue crystal snowflakes and deliberately ate another spoonful. "The boss wants to talk with yous," came a threatening voice from behind him. "You better come and see him if you know what's good for you." There. Now everything was going according to plan. "Oh, reason," said the old wizard. He restrained the fury from his face. The boy before him had been the victim and certainly did not need to be frightened any further. There's nothing that can excuse. What I did to him was worse. The old wizard stiffened in sudden horror. Harry, what have you done? I tricked Draco into believing that I tricked him into participating in a ritual that sacrificed his belief in blood purism, and that meant he couldn't be a Death Eater when he grew up. He lost everything, Headmaster. There was a long quiet in the office, broken only by tiny puffs and whistles of the fiddly things, which, after enough time, had come to seem like silence. Dear me, said the old wizard, I do feel silly. And here I was expecting you might try to redeem the heir of Malfoy by showing him true friendship and kindness. Ha! Yeah, like that would have worked. The old wizard sighed. This was taking it too far. Tell me, Harry, did it ever occur to you that there was something incongruous about setting out to redeem someone through lies and trickery? I did it without telling any direct lies, and since we're talking about Draco Malfoy here, I think the word you're looking for is congruous. The boy looked rather smug. The old wizard shook his head in despair. And this is the hero we're all doomed. That was Act 1, by the way. I'm not quite sure it's out of order, but how he wrote the book. Act 5. The long, narrow tunnel of rough stone, unlit except by a child's wand, seemed to stretch for miles. The reason for this was simple. It did stretch for miles. The time was 3 a.m, and Fred and George were starting the long way down the secret passage that led from a statue of a one-eyed witch in Hogwarts to the cellar of Honeyduke's candy shop in Hogsmeade. How's it doing? Said Fred in a low voice. Not that there'd be anyone listening, but there was something odd about talking in a normal voice when you were going through a secret passage. Still on the fritz, said George. Both, or intermittent. If one fixes itself, one other is the same as ever. The map was an extraordinarily powerful artifact, capable of tracking every sentient being on the school grounds in real time by name. Almost certainly it had been created during the original raising of Hogwarts. It was no good that errors were starting to pop up. Chances were that no one except Dumbledore could fix it if it was broken. The Weasley twins were about to turn the map over to Dumbledore. It would have been an unforgivable insult to the Marauders, the four unknowns who'd managed to steal part of the Hogwarts security system, something probably forged by Salazar Slytherin himself, and twist it into a tool for student pranking. Some might have considered it disrespectful. Some might have considered it criminal. The Weasley twins firmly believed that if Godric Gryffindor had been around to see it, he would have approved. The brothers walked on and on and on, mostly in silence. The Weasley twins talked to each other when they were thinking through new pranks, or when one of them knew something the other didn't. Otherwise, there wasn't much point. If they already knew the same information, they tended to think the same thoughts and make the same decisions. Back in the old days, whenever magical identical twins were born, it had been the custom to kill one of them after the birth. In time, Fred and George clambered out into a dusty cellar, strewn with barrels and racks of strange ingredients. Fred and George waited. It wouldn't have been polite to do anything else. Before too long, a thin old man in black pyjamas clambered down to the steps that led into the cellar, yawning. "Here, boys," said Ambrosius Flume. "I wasn't expecting you tonight. Out of stock already?" Fred and George decided that Fred would speak. "Not exactly, Mr. Flume," said Fred. "We were hoping you could help us with something considerably more interesting." "Now, boys," said Flume, sounding severe, "I hope you didn't wake me up just so I could tell you again that I'm not selling you any merchandise that could get you into real trouble. Not until you're 16 anyways." George drew forth an item from his robes and wordlessly passed it to Flume. "Have you seen this?" said Fred. Flume looked at yesterday's edition of the Daily Prophet and nodded, scowling. The headline on the paper read, "The Next Dark Lord," and showed a young boy with which some student's camera had managed to catch an uncharacteristically cold and grim expression. "I can't believe that Malfoy," Flume snapped. "Going after the boy when he's only 11? The man ought to be ground up and used to make chocolates." Fred and George blinked in unison. Malfoy was behind Rita Skeeter? Harry Potter hadn't warned them about that, which surely meant that Harry didn't know. He never would have brought them in if he did. Fred and George exchanged glances. Well, Harry didn't need to know until after the job was done. "Mr. Flume," Fred said quietly, "the boy who lived needs your help." Flume looked out at them both. Then he let out his breath with a sigh. "All right," said Flume. "What do you want?" Act 6. When Rita Skeeter was intent on a tasty prey, she didn't tend to notice the scurrying ants who constituted the rest of the universe, which was how she almost bumped into the balding young man who stepped into her pathway. "Miss Skeeter," said the man, sounding rather severe and cold for someone whose face looked that young. "Fancy running into you here." "Out of my way, Buster," snapped Rita and tried to step around him. The man in her pathway matched the movement so perfectly that it was like neither of them had moved at all, just stood still while the street shifted around them. Rita Skeeter's eyes narrowed. "Who do you think you are?" "How foolish of me," said the man dryly. "It would have been wise to memorize the face of the distinguished Death Eater, training Harry Potter to be the next Dark Lord after all." A thin smile. "That certainly sounds like someone you wouldn't want to run into on the street, especially after doing a hatchet job on him in the newspaper." Rita Skeeter took a moment to place the reference. This was Quirinus Quirrell? He looked too young and too old at the same time. His face, if it relaxed from its severe and condescending pose, would belong to someone in his late 30s, and his hair was already falling out. Couldn't he afford a healer? No, that wasn't important. She had a time and a place and a beetle to be. She'd just received an anonymous tip about Madame Bones making time with one of her young assistants. That would be worth quite a bonus if she could manage to verify it. Bones was high on her hit list. The tipster had said that Bones and her younger assistant were due to eat lunch in a special room at Mary's place, a very popular room for certain purposes, a room which she found was secure against all listening devices, but not proof against a beautiful blue beetle nestled up against one wall. "Out of my way," Rita said, and tried to push Quirrell from her path. Quirrell's arm brushed her own, deflecting, and Rita staggered as the thrust went into the thin air. Quirrell pulled up the sleeve of his left robe, showing his arm. "Observe," said Quirrell. "No dark mark. I would like your paper to publish a retraction." Rita let out an incredulous laugh. Of course the man wasn't a real Death Eater. The paper wouldn't have published it if he was. "Forget it, Buster. Now take a hike." Quirrell stared at her for a moment. Then he smiled. "Miss Skeeter," said Quirrell, "I had hoped to find some lever that would prove persuasive. Yet I find that I cannot deny myself the pleasure of simply crushing you." "It's been tried. Now get out of my way, Buster, or I'll find some auras and have you arrested for obstruction of journalism." Quirrell swept her a small bow and then walked past. "Goodbye, Rita Skeeter," said the voice from behind her. As Rita bowled on ahead, she noted in the back of her mind that the man was whistling a tune as he walked away. Like that would scare her. Act 4. "Sorry, count me out," said Lee Jordan. "I'm more of the giant spider type." The boy who lived had said that he'd had important work for the Order of Chaos, something serious and secret, more significant and difficult than their usual run of pranks. And then Harry Potter had launched into a speech that was inspiring yet vague, a speech to the effect that Fred and George and Lee had tremendous potential if they could learn to be weirder, to make people's lives surreal instead of just surprising them with the equivalence of buckets of water propped over doors. Fred and George had exclaimed interested looks. They'd never thought of using that one. Harry Potter had invoked a picture of the prank they'd pulled on Neville, which Harry had mentioned with some remorse the Sorting Hat had chewed him out on, but which must have made Neville doubt his own sanity. For Neville, it would have felt like being suddenly transported into an alternate universe, the same way everyone else felt when they'd seen Snape apologise. That was the true power of pranking. "Are you with me?" Harry had cried, and Lee Jordan had answered no. "Count us in," said Fred and George, or possibly George, for there was doubt that Godric Gryffindor would have said yes. Lee Jordan gave a regretful grin and stood up and left the deserted and quieted corridor where the 4 members of the Order of Chaos had met and sat down in a conspiratorial circle. The 3 members of the Order of Chaos got to business. It wasn't that sad. Fred and George would still work with Lee on giant spider pranks, same as ever. They'd only started calling it the Order of Chaos in order to recruit Harry Potter, after Ron had told them about Harry being weird and evil, and Fred and George had decided to save Harry by showing him true friendship and kindness. Thankfully, this no longer seemed necessary, although they weren't quite sure about that. "So," said one of the twins, "what's this about?" "Rita Skeeter," Harry said. "Do you know who she is?" Fred and George nodded, frowning. She's been asking questions about me." That wasn't good news. "Can you guess what I want you to do?" Fred and George looked at each other, a bit puzzled. "You want us to slip her some of our interesting candies?" "No," said Harry. No. That's giant spider thinking. Come on, what would you do if you heard that Rita Skeeter was looking for rumours about you?" That made it obvious. Grins slowly started on the faces of Fred and George. "Start the rumours ourselves," they replied. "Exactly," said Harry, grinning widely. "But these can't just be any rumours. I want to teach people never to believe what the newspaper says about Harry Potter, any more than Muggles believe what the newspaper says about Elvis. At first, I thought about flooding Rita Skeeter with so many rumours that she wouldn't know what to believe. But then she'll just cherry-pick the ones that sound plausible and bad. So what I want to do is create a fake story about me and get Rita Skeeter to believe it somehow. But it has to be something that afterward everyone will know was fake. We want to fool Rita Skeeter and her editors, and afterward have the proof come out that it was false. And of course, given that those are the requirements, the story has to be as ridiculous as it can possibly be and still get printed. Do you understand what I want you to do?" "Not exactly," Fred and George said slowly. "You want us to invent the story." "I want you to do all of it," Harry Potter said. "I'm sort of busy right now. Plus, I want to be able to say truthfully that I had no idea what was coming. Surprise me." For a moment, there was a very evil grin on the faces of Fred and George. Then they turned serious. "But Harry, we really don't know how to do anything like that." "So figure it out," Harry said. "I have confidence in you. Not total confidence, but if you can't do it, tell me that, and I'll try something else. or do it myself. If you have a really good idea for both the ridiculous story and how you can convince Rita Skeeter and her editors to print it, then you can go ahead and do it. But don't go with something mediocre. If you can't come up with something awesome, just say so. Fred and George exchanged worried glances. I can't think of anything, said George. Neither can I, said Fred. Sorry. Harry stared at them, and then Harry began to explain how you went about thinking of things. It had been known to take longer than 2 seconds, said Harry. You never called any question impossible, said Harry, until you had taken an actual clock and thought about it for 5 minutes by the motion of the minute hand. Not 5 minutes metaphorically, 5 minutes by a physical clock. And furthermore, Harry said, his voice emphatic and his right hand thumping hard on the floor, you did not start out immediately looking for solutions. Harry then launched into an explanation of a test done by someone named Norman Mayer, who was something called an organizational psychologist, and who'd asked 2 different sets of problem-solving groups to tackle a problem. Let me just check something. 1, 2, 3, 4 more pages. So we're getting a little over time, but I think we're just going to finish. The problem, Harry said, had involved 3 employees doing their jobs. The junior employee just wanted to do the easiest job. The senior employee wanted to rotate them between jobs to avoid boredom. An efficiency expert had recommended giving the junior person the easiest job and the senior person the hardest job, which would be 20% more productive. One set of problem-solving groups had been given the instruction, do not propose solutions until the problem has been discussed as thoroughly as possible without suggesting any. The other set of problem-solving groups had been given no instructions, and those people had done the natural thing and reacted to the presence of a problem by proposing solutions. And people had gotten attached to those solutions and started fighting about them and arguing about the relative importance of freedom versus efficiency and so on. The first set of problem-solving groups, the ones given instructions to discuss the problem first and then solve it, had been far more likely to hit up the solution of letting the junior employee keep the easiest job and rotating the other 2 people between the other 2 jobs for what the experts said would be a 19% improvement. Starting out by looking for solutions was taking things entirely out of order, like starting a meal with a dessert, only bad. Harry also quoted someone named Robin Dawes as saying that the harder a problem was, the more likely people were to try and solve it immediately. So Harry was going to leave this problem to Fred and George, and they would discuss all the aspects of it and brainstorm anything they thought might be remotely relevant. And they should try and come up with an actual solution, and they shouldn't try and come up with an actual solution until they finished doing that. Unless, of course, they did happen to randomly think of something awesome, in which case they could write it down for afterward and then go back to thinking. And he didn't want to hear back from them about any so-called failures to think of anything for at least a week. Some people spent decades trying to think of things. Any questions? Said Harry. Fred and George stared at each other. I can't think of any. Neither can I. Harry coughed gently. You didn't ask about your budget. Budget, they thought. I could just tell you the amount, Harry said, but I think this will be more inspiring. Harry's hands dipped into his robes and brought forth. Fred and George almost fell over, even though they were sitting down. Don't spend it all for the sake of spending it, Harry said. On the stone floor in front of them gleamed an absolutely ridiculous amount of money. Only spend it if awesomeness requires, and what awesomeness does require, don't hesitate to spend. If there's anything left over, just return it afterward. I trust you. Oh, and you get 10% of what's there, regardless of how much you end up spending. We can't, blurted one of the twins. We don't accept money for that sort of thing. The twins never took money for doing anything illegal. Unknown to Ambrosius Flume, they were selling all of his merchandise at 0% markup. Fred and George wanted to be able to testify under veritaserum, if necessary, that they had not been profiteering criminals, just providing a public service. Harry frowned at them. But I'm asking you to put in some real work here. A grown-up would get paid for doing something like this, and it would still count as a favour for a friend. You can't just hire people for this sort of thing. Fred and George shook their heads. Fine, Harry said. I'll just get you an expensive Christmas presents, and if you try returning them to me, I'll burn them. Now you don't even know how much I'm going to spend on you, except, obviously, that it's going to be more than if you'd just taken the money. And I'm going to buy you those presents anyway, so think about that before you tell me you can't think of anything awesome. Harry stood up smiling and turned to go while Fred and George were still gaping in shock. He strode a few steps away and then turned back. Oh, one last thing, Harry said. Leave Professor Quirrell out of whatever you do. He doesn't like publicity. I know it'd be easier to get people to believe weird things about the defense professor than anyone else. And I'm sorry to have to get in your way like that, but please leave Professor Quirrell out of it. And Harry turned again and took a few more steps, looked back one more time and said softly, Thank you, and left. There was a long pause after he departed. So, said one. So, said the other. The defense professor doesn't like publicity, does he? Harry doesn't know us very well, does he? No, he doesn't. But we won't use his money for that, of course. Of course not. That wouldn't be right. We'll do the defense professor separately. We'll get some Gryffindors to write Skeeter and say, his sleeve lifted up one time in defense class and they saw the dark mark. And he's probably teaching Harry Potter all sorts of dreadful things. And he's the worst defense professor anyone remembers in Hogwarts. He's not just failing to teach us, he's getting everything wrong, the complete opposite of what it should be. Like when he claimed that you could only cast the killing curse using love, which made it pretty useless. I like that one. Thanks. I like the defense professor. I bet the defense professor likes it too. He does have a sense of humour. He wouldn't have called us what he did if he didn't have a sense of humour. But are we really going to be able to do Harry's job? Harry said to discuss the problem before trying to solve it, so let's do that. The Weasley twins decided that George would be the enthusiastic one, while Fred doubted. It all seems sort of contradictory, said Fred. He wants it to be ridiculous enough that everyone laughs at Skeeter and knows it's wrong, and wants Skeeter to believe it. We can't do both things at the same time. We'll have to fake some evidence to convince Skeeter, said George. Was that a solution? Said Fred. They considered this. Maybe, said George. But I don't think we should be all that strict about it, do you? The twins shrugged helplessly. So then the fake evidence has to be good enough to convince Skeeter, said Fred. Can we really do that on our own? We don't have to do it on our own, said George, and pointed to the pile of money. We can hire enough people to help us. The twins got a thoughtful look on their face. That could use up Harry's budget pretty fast, said Fred. This is a lot of money for us, but it's not a lot of money for someone like Flume. Maybe people will give discounts if they know it's for Harry, said George. But most importantly of all, whatever we do, it has to be impossible. Fred blinked. What do you mean impossible? Impossible that we don't get in trouble, because no one believes we could have done it. So impossible that even Harry starts wondering. It has to be surreal. It has to make people doubt their own sanity. It has to be better than Harry. Fred's eyes were wide in astonishment. This happened sometimes between them, but not often. But why? They were pranks. They were all pranks. The pie was a prank. The rim roll was a prank. Kevin Entwistle's cat was a prank. Snape was a prank. We're the best pranksters in Hogwarts. Are we going to roll over and give up without a fight? He's the boy who lived, said Fred. And we're the Weasley twins. He's challenging us. We said we could do what he does, but I bet he doesn't think we'll ever be as good as him. He's right, said Fred, feeling rather nervous. The Weasley twins did sometimes disagree, even when they had all the same information. But every time they did, it seemed unnatural, like at least one of them must be doing something wrong. This is Harry Potter we're talking about. He can do the impossible. We can't. Yes, we can, said George. And we have to be more impossible than him. But, said Fred, it's what Godric Gryffindor would do, said George. That settled it, and the twins snapped back into whatever it was that was normal for them. All right, then, let's think about it. And that brings us to the end of chapter 4. Got through 2 chapters today. Thanks so much for sticking with me, and glad you had a great time. See you next week.